Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our bite-sized session, which is in relation to the Employment Rights Act 2025. And today's session, we're going to be focusing on the new trade union changes that are coming in. Some have already taken place, come into play from December. And some early February. So this session today is going to be about 25 minutes long. And if anyone's got any questions throughout, then you can pop them into the Q&A section and then we can have a look and answer them at the end. What we're going to be covering today is the new trade union regulations and the changes on how employees are expected to work with unions in practice, especially around recognition, consultation and industrial action. So some of what we'll look at today will feel familiar because the core principles haven't changed or haven't disappeared, but the way that we're now expected to apply them will be shifted. So we'll look at that, where the risks are and how they sit in organisations if you carry on without checking your processes properly. So we'll have a run through of what it all looks like, keep it practical and focus on what's actually changed and what it means for day-to-day HR and management decisions and where things are most likely to go wrong if they're not handled correctly. So hopefully by the end of the session today, you'll have a clearer sense of what you might need to tweak and what you can leave alone, and you've already got good processes in place. So looking at the changes ahead on the agenda, these are the key changes in the employment law and the trade union rules. As I said, some have already come into play from 2025, but they're going to be running throughout and coming into effect throughout 26 and 27. So we'll run through each section of these on the agenda. And as I say, it's 25 minutes long, so we won't be going into too much detail, but it'll give you a brief overview of what you may need to prepare for in terms of how changes might affect your teams or your policies and as I say, your processes. So these updates are all aligned with ACAS guidance. So you're not just learning the theory today, but you're seeing what the best practice looks like. And overall, all of these changes here on the slide, they are part of a bigger trend to strengthen the employee protections, really, particularly around strikes, some big change in consultation and general union activity. Okay, so if we look at the next slide on what's changing, a brief overview of the main points of what's changing. We've got the removal of minimum service level rules for strike action. So employees will no longer be able to require a minimum number of staff to work during a strike. We'll look at that in a bit more detail on the next slide. We've got stronger protection from dismissal during industrial action, which means legal protections are being strengthened. So employees taking part in lawful industrial action are less likely to be fairly dismissed. Greater protection from a detriment for taking part in industrial action. And that means that the law is expanding to better protect employees from being treated unfavourably for participating in industrial action. And then the wider trade union reforms for 25 or through to 2027 will be a broader set of changes aimed at generally increasing trade union rights, which will influence and the ability to organise those rights within workplaces. So first off, if we look at the next slide on the removal of minimum service level rules. So what that actually means is so this come into practice in 18th December 2025, and what it was before is that some sectors had rules that required a certain number of staff to stay on duty during industrial action. Well, that's now gone, and employees have full legal freedom to participate in lawful strikes. And as an employer, we can't enforce them to work. So previously, the law might have required some staff to stay, and now legally they can strike and they can just walk out. And you'd have to manage with the remaining team who chose not to participate in any strike action. So really what you would need to think about is think ahead about operational impacts, practical planning, which is key, obviously, which tasks are absolutely essential for that day, depending on what sector that you're in, particularly, a lot of our schools are unionised, and quite prone to industrial action. So looking at what lessons can be covered and what cover you would need, whether that be temporary staff or flexible cover to help. Just looking and planning ahead for even those small adjustments that can make sure that you keep the business running, as opposed to having to close. I suppose communication's critical in that. Staff would need clear guidance about the expectations and the boundaries, and letting clients, customers know, parents, that type of things for schools and colleges, and getting some realistic information about any delays or service changes as soon as possible. And then finally, to remember, what the legal risk is if you try and enforce minimum staffing or coerce staff to stay, even not generally meaning to, then that ultimately could face you in it with a tribunal claim, because generally it would now be classed as unlawful. So planning, communicating, and making sure you've got some flexible options are your best protections in terms of the minimum service level rules. Thanks, Maisie. If you do the next slide. And then we've got some stronger dismissal protection coming into practice from 18th of February 2026. And what that means is if someone takes part in a lawful strike, you can't dismiss them because of that. So previously, if an employee was dismissed for taking part in industrial action, whether that was direct or indirectly, they could only claim for unfair dismissal if it happened within the first 12 weeks of that strike period. And after 12 weeks, there was no protection. So you could technically dismiss someone without it being automatically unfair. So the 2026 change removes that loophole completely, and any dismissal connected to lawful industrial action is automatically unfair, no matter when it happens. So even if you're frustrated or short-staffed or, whatever the reason's been, you can't dismiss someone for striking. In terms of what counts as lawful industrial action, it's action being taken by employees in accordance with the legal rules. So they have to give proper notice, they have to have a valid ballot, and it has to be within the scope of their workplace or the union. An unlawful action, for example, would be striking without a proper ballot, and that wouldn't be protected. So they would have to go through the proper process and the proper ballot. But if we look at an example of, an SME or an independent school, and they lose 2 staff temporarily because they're taking part in a strike, managers or, heads may feel that there's a pressure to adjust those workloads, or potentially without realising discipline staff, but we can't touch their employment contracts unfairly. And the focus should be on managing the workflow and covering, the essential tasks. Making sure that we document everything is also critical, keeping detailed notes of meetings and HR decisions, communications, and any operational adjustments as well, so that we can protect the business if a situation did ever end up in a tribunal. And then we've got, obviously, to make sure that we communicate clearly with the staff and explain what's expected during their absence, reassure them of their rights, and maintain fairness and transparency. So ultimately, the goal is for us to keep the workplace running as smooth as possible and reduce any risks, so that we're not compromising the business in any way and landing us in a tribunal, forgetting what the new legislation is. So again, making sure we get our policies updated in terms of anyone who's got any recognised unions, but also for, general hospitality or retail businesses, making sure that we still are aware of what that new legislation looks like for people who are in a recognised union outside of the workplace. Okay, and then if we take a look at industrial action notice and ballots on the next slide, that also come into practice on 18th February 2026. And what that means is we've now got the notice period is shorter. It's 10 days instead of 14. And that means that strikes can happen faster. So our businesses need to be ready quickly, really. 10 days notice isn't a lot of time. So there's alongside that, the support threshold has been removed. You only need, well, previously in certain sectors, you needed at least 40% of eligible members to support action. And now all that matters is that more votes are in favour than against. So the 50% turnout rule still applies, but that's only up until August 2026 this year. So again, it's making it easier for that industrial action to happen. Alongside that as well, picket supervisors are no longer required. That again simplifies things for unions. And with the mandates that last 12 months instead of 6, ballots and action notices have been really simplified too. So it means less paperwork and clearer processes. Also, there's a political funding rule, and that's changed. So employees can contribute if they want, but they can't be forced to. So we need to let payroll know, and they need to process things accurately to reflect any opt-outs. And employers need to be showing that we can provide clear written guidance of that. So I suppose for SMEs, the practical takeaway in terms of these changes is to basically to plan ahead, keep your managers updated, trained where you can, keep a neutral approach and make sure we still document everything and keep clear records. Even if we've got a small team, the changes can really affect operations. So having a clear plan helps to reduce any disruption and risk. But up until now, all statutory ballots for industrial action had also been, usually done by post. And there's going to be some changes in that as well in terms of how you can now vote. From August 26th, that employees will be able to vote electronically or even if agreed in person at the workplace. I suppose why it matters for you as an employer, it means that ballots can succeed faster and more easily. More members can take part, even in small teams. So strike votes can be approved more quickly than before. And I guess, that makes planning for strike action more important for having those contingency plans in place, because ultimately we can't rely on the old delays from postal ballots. Okay, you look at the next slide, please, Maisie. So collective redundancy and trade union recognition. There's going to be some changes with effect from literally last week, 6th of April. And the maximum protective award for failing to consult doubles from 90 to 180 days pay. So I feel as though this new legislation has kind of gone under the radar or has been underestimated a little bit. There's these two key changes. And first, the maximum protective awards for failing to consult in a collective redundancy situation, it now doubles. So what that actually looks like in terms of however many redundancies you're making. So, by the way, the rules would only apply if you're making 20 or more redundancies at one site within a 90-day period. So, for example, if you had 20 staff in, let's say, £30,000 a year, and if you as a business fail to consult properly, a protective award could reach up to, over £1 million, because it would be per person 180 days pay per employee. So, that really shows why planning and the documentation are critical. You wouldn't want to be put in a situation where you got to that amount and failed on those collective consultation regulations. So, secondly from that, trade union recognition is now simpler. The process for a union to be recognised in the workplace has been streamlined, so that can make discussions and negotiations easier as well. So I guess the takeaway for this is that even if you are below the 20-person threshold at one site, it's still best practice to consult properly and document everything. And if you do cross that threshold, following those rules and regulations protects your business and will keep you compliant. So one thing really to be mindful of is that when you do need to collectively consult, or if you're not sure, just double check, find out, get some advice, don't kind of take a risk on it. And especially there's some other changes coming up later on in 2027 in relation to collective redundancies as well. So it kind of ties in with this one in relation to having multiple sites and multiple venues, which we'll have a look at in a second. So on our trade union and ballot and electronic voting, we've kind of discussed that a little bit up to now. And as I said before, what it means is that ballots can succeed faster and more easily because more members can take part, even in smaller teams. It can be approved more quickly that there's a strike. Previously, under the Trade Union Act, there had been that 50% turnout, and as I said, that's now changed. So there's lots of things in the direction going for trade unions to make it easier, more successful for people to join, more successful for people to vote and ballot, which really indicates that it's more likely that we would get more industrial action than before, because it just makes it generally easier for people to be to do that and to be involved and to want to not have to go out of the way to do those ballots. It just makes it easier to do. So if we look at the next slide on trade union rights and detriment protection. So what this means is from October 2026, new rights for union reps will come into practice, and that's in terms of access and facilities, accommodation and time off. So before, union reps had, I suppose, limited statutory rights, and access was often negotiated locally and internally and not be guaranteed. So, kind of more of general discretionary and dependent on whether employers' agreement or distant recognition, trade union policies, what was in place there. Union representatives are being given clearer rights now to access the workplace and use facilities and take time off to carry out their duties. So nothing major, no big changes there, but more of a note to update our policies in terms of what their entitlement is. And before, union reps are protected in some areas, but the protection against being treated unfavourably for any union activity was slightly narrower and often harder to rely on in practice, unless it was linked to a specific protected act. So this protection against the detriment is now also being added from October this year. Workers cannot be treated worse because of industrial action. And really, it's that simple for businesses. You need to think about practical examples. You can't withhold training, reduce bonuses, or increase someone's workload just because they went on strike. These actions will be considered a detriment, and the same goes for the new union representatives regulations. A union rep attends a meeting with management, and then let's say after that they may lose some overtime or lose a better shift, even though the work hasn't changed. So previously it was hard to prove that this was because of the union role unless there was some sort of clear evidence, but now that kind of treatment is much riskier for the employer if it looks like it's linked to their union activity. So again, practical steps here is to make sure that policies are clear, accessible and up to date, and that our staff understand their rights, and managers should know what those boundaries are. And then finally, when hiring, employers are not legally obligated to mention trade unions or the right to join one at the moment. So now that's just changed. Now employers are expected to actively tell workers that they've got the right to join a union. So usually that will be in the form of some kind of an induction, if you have them. If not, then we're looking at adding that into our employment contracts and some form of written contracts that we've got, or handbooks. So we just need a clause to be put in there to make sure that we're making everybody aware that they've got the right to join a union. Okay, and then next slide, if we look at collective redundancy, we touched on it before in relation to the 90-day pay doubling. And this one comes into practice in 2027, but it's really important that we kind of get our processes in place early with this one, particularly if you are a business that has multiple sites. So whereas looking at what practical steps we really need to take. So if you are considering redundancies across the whole organisation, it can no longer just be one site. So that would have an impact on the number of redundancies. So if you've got multiple sites that are separate entities, may be different. If you've got, let's say, 10 employees that you were looking at making redundant, or 6 in one site and then 6 in another, and 6 in another, whatever that amount is, that takes you over that 20 affected employees, that could trigger the collective consultation requirements. So even if each site has fewer than 20 affected employees, the total would trigger those consultation requirements. So really what we want to be doing is to look how to map out the redundancies across the site, so you know if you've hit that threshold for collective consultation, even if you're a small office in multiple towns, or it would all count towards the total. And then we have here, in terms of stronger anti-discrimination protections for union members. We've kind of covered that really in terms of what those detrimental rights look like. And then we've got a new industrial relations framework that's going to come in 2027. And really what that looks like is, in short, it's basically a new rule book for how collective employee relations and trade unions activity will operate in the UK from 2027 onwards. And that will be the combination of the trade union votes and ballots for either recognising a union or removing recognition of a union. And that can also be done electronically instead of by post or in person. So the recognition is when a majority of workers vote to formally allow a union to represent them in negotiations, and a derecognition is when they vote to remove that status. So in practice, employees can vote, again, like I said, online, which is designed to make it more easy and practical to make decisions about whether a union is formally recognised within the workplace. So next slide on our key union changes. To just take us towards the end of the session, we've got some strong employee protection during industrial action. What would we really be looking to do is to first plan ahead, think about redundancies, strikes, and how to keep the operations running. Make sure we document everything. Meetings, decisions, any communications that we've made, protect both your staff and your business. Train our managers so that they understand the new rules and how to respond appropriately. Engage with staff, make sure we've got that clear communication so that reduces any misunderstandings or potential disputes. If we're clear in our communication, it makes life so much easier. HR and management teams, having a look at what the policies look like, review them as soon as possible, make sure that they reflect the latest changes that have already happened, and making sure that we've got it on our radar to update them for the next changes in August and October this year, and then through to 2027, particularly around redundancies and union rights. Keep things simple, keep things consistent and fair in your approach. Preparation is always the best legal defence, really, so making sure we keep that communication open and transparent. We're not saying that because these trade union rights are now more in favour of unions, it makes it that we want to hide things. We're being open and transparent. If you want to join a union, this is now written in your contract, making sure we've got all of that legislation, that we're fully compliant and up to date. And, ultimately making sure that we plan, train, document everything properly, minimise the risk and protect the business as much as we can. And I think there was just one final bit I meant to just touch on. I'm not sure which slide it was on now. Just having a quick look going back. but it was really just on the changes in terms of the trade union date in relation to foreign ships, and the seafarer legislation. So that change extends the redundancy and consultation protections to crew on ships registered outside Great Britain. I know it sounds quite complex, but if you were in that type of industry, shipping or logistics or maritime services, then it would make a lot more sense. So, as long as the ship regularly operates from a UK port, um, these employees now get the same consultation rights and potential protective awards as UK staff. So before, because let's say the ship was registered abroad, these protections might not have applied. So for any of our smaller SME businesses in those industries, then really it's simple as that, to treat these crew members like any other UK employees when planning any redundancies or consultations. And all of this will be as in that new rule book, if you like, for how collective employee relations and trade union activity will operate in the UK from 2027 onwards. And I think that brings us to the end of the session, which just ties up just nicely for our 25 minutes. So thank you for everyone for attending today. As last slide just up there for just to let you know that our next session will be on family leave rights and the Fair Work Agency. And that's going to be on Thursday, the 14th of May, the same time, 10 till 25 past. So there's going to be a lot to kind of go through there. The Fair Work Agency looks like great fun. So look forward to seeing you all on that session. But thank you for your time this morning and have a lovely day.